Dr. Chris Bataille is an economist and economic modeler, and he's been involved with the Net Zero Steel project. So I'm going to talk to him about that because it's really important that steel and cement and so on are considered to be the hardest to decarbonize. But the project report that he's been working on suggests that maybe that's not the case. So welcome to the interview, Chris.
Hi, Markham. Nice to see you today.
Well, look, why don't we start with an overview of the Net Zero Steel project? What can you tell us?
Sure. So steel and cement are one of my specialties. And one of the things, steel accounts for somewhere between 6 and 10% of all CO2 we put into the air, from the energy supply and demand, not including agriculture. Now, it's been considered hard to abate for a long time, and it was always considered to be the last thing we do along with cement, what have you. But when the net zero target came around about 5 years ago, and the fact that to hold any sort of temperature, we have to get to net zero, it has now become incumbent that these sectors go to zero as well, and as quickly as possible. Now, that's challenging because they're very GHG intense. They're critical. It's not like the oil and gas industry. We're still going to need steel and cement, through to the end of the century and beyond. It's what we build everything out of. What most of our civilization's made out of. And the core technologies are very GHG emitting. Now, the other thing is the facilities last a long time. There's a minimum of 25 years between the furnace relinings, and typically a facility gets its furnace relined over and over again until it just becomes not economically viable. And a lot of older steel facilities have been around since the late 1800s. They've just been continually revamped. So what we did is we thought, okay, what does this really mean in terms of getting steel to zero? Because we know there are several different technologies out there to bring the emissions down a lot. The first one is use less steel, like when we're making cars, buildings, infrastructure, what have you, but that has limits. The second one is recycle as much as possible. So iron, in theory, is infinitely recyclable as long as we don't contaminate it, especially with copper. The more copper gets in there, and I'm thinking the copper from electric wiring, what have you, it starts to become not useful for thin steel, and eventually it's only useful for rebar in buildings, which is a small part of what we use it for. So first thing is recycle as much as possible. Demand for different countries tends to rise when they're building a lot of infrastructure and then fall later on. So China's at the very peak of its infrastructure build. Ours happened a while ago, but India and Africa's big infrastructure pulse is coming. So we have to make sure they have clean technologies to work with before their big development rise comes along. Now, there's a couple of different primary ways to decarbonize the primary technologies. You can put carbon capture and storage on them. We haven't mastered post-combustion carbon capture and storage for blast furnaces yet. It hasn't worked out yet. Maybe it'll work out, but we really haven't put the oomph into it that we need to master that technology. CCS can be used for what's called direct reduced iron making technology. It's a newer technology. And the interesting thing about that technology is that we can swap the reductant gas in there for full hydrogen. So we can potentially make fully green steel using direct reduced iron technology, followed by an electric arc furnace, which is the same thing we use for recycling. So that's a lot of technical detail, but basically the idea behind the project was we got a database of 20 steel facilities globally in 2019. We had to massage that and work with that to get to something that made sense, that matched global emissions. And then we estimated what the dates were for each facility from the last furnace relining. And then we just simply walked the database forward, saying, well, what technologies could firms use in that place to replace those facilities?
Right. Okay, so there are a number of technologies that are available now or soon will be. As I understand it, in 2019, there were 835 facilities in 94 countries. Yep. So you've analyzed how these technologies might be applied to those facilities going forward as they need to be refurbished. And what kind of conclusions did you come to?
The interesting thing that we did not expect is that if we get on the problem immediately and use the technologies that are available to us today, so as of 2025, if we build no new blast furnaces, unabated blast furnaces, and everything new is replaced with something clean, and we make some assumptions about when the more exotic stuff comes available, we can get to net zero by 2050. But it means everybody has to be able, and this has to happen really fast in China and in Asia, because by far the majority of the world's steel production occurs in Asia.
And what are the likelihood of what's the likelihood of that happening, Chris? I know we've got COP26 coming up at Glasgow next month. Is this on policymakers' radar?
That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to put it on their radar. We know the Chinese steel, we know global steel firms are thinking about this. They don't want to do it. It's a lot of work. But if it becomes a condition of doing business for them, if we set policies such that all their new facilities have to be clean by a given date, they can get it done. It's going to cost something. They're going to have to pass some cost down to consumers, but it really means only an increase of half to 2% in a car, in a building, in infrastructure.
Now, what about the materials that are available to substitute for steel? And I think we've talked about carbon fiber in automobiles for a long, long time.
Right.
And, where are we with that? Is there any prospect of that happening in the near to medium term?
Well, the interesting thing is when you think about what was steel is infinitely recyclable, right? So if we design vehicles well that are easy to take apart, there's no problem with using steel. Heavy, yes, obviously heavier vehicles use more fuel, but if they're using clean electricity, that's not as much of a problem. Now, the primary substitute in most vehicles is actually going to be aluminum, and plastic will only be used for non-impact items. Now, the problem with plastic is that we have virtually no planning in place and no infrastructure in place to recycle it. So we have the networks in place to recycle steel product to aluminum product, but not plastics. A lot of it just goes to the landfill or simply gets burnt.
Okay, so what are this report has come out. You're trying to influence the policymakers at COP26. Yep. How are you going to do that?
Well, it's me amongst many, many other people. Like, think of me as technical support for political people who really want to get this thing done. And the key thing is the very first thing we need is to get governments to commit to what we call lead markets, public and private lead markets. So, when they're building infrastructure, when they're building buildings, bridges, what have you, just prefer the green steel if possible. If there's only a small cost difference, build that into the contracting, right? That can make a huge difference to a steel company, when it's making the plans, whether or not to build a green steel plant. On the private side, and this is already happening in Europe, you get car makers, machinery makers to commit to buying the green steel that comes out of these things, because it only costs them a little bit more. It costs the steel makers a lot more to make this stuff currently. Eventually the price will come down. But for car makers, machinery makers, what have you, it's not a whole lot. They can pass the costs on to consumers and they can brand that product. So, if you're buying a Tesla or you're buying an electric vehicle, you're going to be paying more these days. It only costs a few $100 extra to make that out of green steel.
So if I understand this argument correctly, it is more expensive to make green steel, but the amount per vehicle, say in this case, is only a couple of $100, which is not a crippling amount.
No, exactly.
Okay, great. Well, Chris, thank you very much for this, and we'll be watching your net zero steel project with interest.
Well, thanks very much, Markham, and have a good day.